How's everyone's week going?
Good. Hi.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Glad that y'all are here. Before we jump in, I know that Joyce has a question from this week, but I'm tabling your question for about 15 minutes from now.
Okay.
Any other questions from last week before we dive in? All right. I will share the recording because I know, Michaela, you weren't able to make it, but I will share the recording online. I just need to upload it because the YouTube Live wasn't working last week. So I will upload that so that you can watch.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. And what I'd love to start out with is something that we weren't able to see last week just because of timing. And there's the Torah is made up of 5 books. Can you remind me what those 5 books are? Anyone can jump in.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
There we go. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 5 books of Moses. And we read those 5 books. We spread them out throughout the year and we read little bits and pieces every week of the year so that we add up to the entire book and we celebrate each and every year as we start and finish the book on a holiday called Simchat Torah. Now, we read these if we have enough people in our community present. We read from a scroll that's handwritten, that's put together by hand. So we're going to watch this video and we're going to learn a little bit about how that scroll is put together and about the significance of that scroll. If you're watching, everyone else is watching other than Joyce and me. If you're watching on a different computer, give me a thumbs up to tell me that you can hear the sound on here. Great.
I'm not hearing it now.
Thank you. I'll start over and see if it works. Here.
The Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and it's the source and base of the Jewish tradition, revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by God. And we're the people of the book, so this is the book. When a Torah is read in synagogues, it has to be read from a scroll, and it has to be written in a particular way, by hand. My name is Julie Seltzer, and I'm currently working as a scribe, a soferet in Hebrew, which means that I write sacred writings. My role in this exhibit is to write a Torah that will be used in synagogues and in communities that are in need of a Torah. I'm a new scribe. This will be my first complete Torah. It's a science. It's a science that I'm still learning. Traditionally, you go to a school and you learn how to be a scribe as a student of scribing. But as a woman, these schools were not open to me. So in the beginning of my process, I looked online and I taught myself some of the basics. And then eventually I found a teacher. And from there, that's when I really started learning the craft and how to properly form the letters. And it's also when I began learning the laws associated with scribing. You start with parchment. And parchment is made from the skin of a kosher animal. And then there's something to write with, which is the quill, which is, for me, the most challenging aspect currently. Cutting the quill from a feather, just getting it the right size, the right sharpness, the right angle, the right flow of ink. Before starting a project, and often during a project, it's traditional to go to a mikveh, a ritual bath, which is really for spiritual elevation. And also before you begin the project, you have to state an intention out loud that you're doing this writing for the sake of the sanctity of what it is that you're writing. A Torah has 304,805 letters. Not one more, not one less, or else the entire thing is invalid. Every letter has rules that govern how the letter has to be written, because a letter can't look too much like another letter. If you look at a Torah closely, there are score lines. At the top of each line, there's an indentation, and it keeps the line straight. Another interesting rule is that there can't be a barrier between the hand and the Torah. I can't wear gloves that cover my hands. Another rule is that you can't write from memory. So even if I chanted this particular section at my bat mitzvah and I know it by heart, I still have to look at the written text and I have to say each word out loud before I write it. I have the photocopy of the tikkun, so I underline each line that I write so I can follow where I am exactly. If my eye goes to the wrong place, I know where I am. It makes it easier to not make mistakes. The biggest myth about scribing that I've encountered is the myth that scribes can't make any errors, or else they have to start over from the very beginning of the Torah. If and when I make a mistake, if I catch it right then and there, I try to remove as much ink as I can because it would be easier to scrape off. Some days will be better than others. Everyone has their bad days. Generally, for me, it's a bad quill day, which just means that I'm forming and reforming the quills. But in the end, it's worth it because if you cut a good quill, then the writing goes really smoothly. Sometimes I'm in the story. I'm experiencing the story as I'm writing it. It's more of a narrative section. And sometimes I'm really not thinking at all about anything. I'm just writing. but it's meditative. And I'm hearing the words, I'm looking at the words, I'm saying the words. You have to say every word of the Torah out loud before you write it. So I'm saying the word, hearing myself say it, and then writing it. Every single person that writes a Torah is going to write a slightly different looking Torah, even though it's completely anonymous. I'm not signing it. It's not my creative stamp. And I don't want that. It's a submission to something much larger than yourself. There's really nothing different about the Torah that I would create now versus 2,000 years ago in terms of the words and the letters. And that's part of what's amazing about this work is that I'm writing the same words as have been written for this many years. And for me personally, it just connects me back to something bigger, something greater, something much more timeless than me and my very impermanent, quick visit on this earth.
I asked a question in the chat. Why give so much care and precision to the composition of this Torah scroll? And Cortina answered, it's because Adonai's words are delicate and powerful. And Adonai is one of our sacred names of God. It's actually the nickname of our sacred name of God, but we imbue the sacred name with so much power that that name Adonai is seen as very sacred as well. Sephora said to maintain its purity and not alter it in any way. Any other reasons why we might be so careful? But absolutely, these are seen as and believed to be God's words, and so we have to make sure that we write them very, very distinctly. We write each letter very distinctly. We also see this when we're chanting the Torah, when we're reading the Torah out loud. We have the Torah reader standing in the middle who's reading the Torah from the scroll. And then we have two people standing next to the Torah reader to correct them should they make any errors. We're not trying to be nitpicky for the sake of being nitpicky, but we're wanting to make sure that, especially because this is a foreign language, this is not a language that many of us speak fluently. Even Israelis don't speak biblical Hebrew every day. We want to make sure that we're saying each word exactly as God recited to Moses on Mount Sinai. Questions about that? All right. I just X'd out of that, which I didn't mean to do, but I want to go back to our slideshow from last week, because there was one slide that I wasn't very sure about. I want to make sure that we cover that again. As we looked at the matriarchs, the patriarchs, and Moses and the people of Israel's journey around this region. So I want to touch base about this and just explain a little bit about where we are and where each of these places are on the map. So Ur comes about in the 11th chapter of Genesis. This is where Abraham is born. Abraham's our first patriarch, our first official patriarch. He starts out as Avram and later becomes Abraham. Once he has a more intimate relationship with God, God changes his name to Abraham. He has a stopping point in Haran. So God says, Lech Lecha, go to the land of Israel, which is right around here, really over here, or not over there, but right around here is the land of Israel, south here. And so Abraham goes to Haran as one of his stopping points. Then the land of Canaan, which will later be Israel. We get to Shechem, which is especially where Jacob spends a lot of time in Shechem. We also have Hebron around there as well. So we go to Shechem, then Avram will go to Egypt for a while because of famine. Then he'll come back to Hebron. We'll see a lot of our main characters are going to be buried in Hebron, and still to this day, there's a cave where you can visit the legendary burial site of a lot of our matriarchs and patriarchs. That will be there. Then we are driven by famine again at the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph makes his journey over to Egypt, and his whole family follows him over to the land of Goshen, which is Egypt. And that's where the Israelites stay for a few hundred years. Joseph gets us to Goshen. Then when Moses says, "Let my people go," and the people go, we'll go to Sinai. And then we'll travel around this area for about 40 years. We'll walk around in circles for about 40 years because as we're about to get into Israel, the people aren't ready yet. So God says, you need another 40 years, you need another generation. This generation is going to die off, and then the new generation will go into the land of Israel. And they enter the land of Israel right about here. Questions, comments, concerns about our geographical journey? Great. Today, we're going to go a little bit farther than Torah. So we said Torah was those 5 books of Moses, but that's not the end of our Hebrew Bible. I want to start out with an explanation of language, about the language that I'm using. You might have noticed I use the words Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. I don't say Old Testament. And I think we talked a little bit about this last week, but just to touch base again, we don't call it the Old Testament, even though it uses the same books, different order, but really the same exact books as at least the Protestant version of the Old Testament. We see the Tanakh as the entirety of our Bible. We call it the Hebrew Bible. It's the entirety of our Bible. The Tanakh includes the Torah, those 5 books, but it also includes books of prophets and books of writings. We'll zoom in just a few minutes to that, but more on this topic. Oh, somebody's here. But more on this topic. Traditionally, the Torah is seen to be these God's words written down by Moses. Prophets, all the prophetic books, are seen as written by the prophets themselves, speaking God's words. And writings are written by various biblical figures like Kings David and Solomon. So they're divinely inspired, but not divinely written. We do have other sacred texts that we'll learn about later in our class. We'll learn about the Mishnah and Talmud, which were written between 0 and 600 of the Common Era. We'll learn different Jewish legal texts as well. And there are prayer books, lots of different texts. But the Tanakh itself is the ultimate source of all these rabbinic and Jewish legal writings. It's not old, but it lives on. We call it Torat Chaim, the living Torah, through all the ways in which we enact its words every day. So instead of the Old Testament, we call it the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. So I'll challenge you throughout this class to call these books of Torah, prophets, and writings the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible, because regardless of our faith tradition, recognizing this text as still alive and relevant can help give us a new appreciation of the ever-present possibilities of our ancient text. Questions about this calling of it as the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, before we delve in? All right. We're going to work from the textbook today because I really do like the way that it's set up. Our text, by the way, comes from American Jewish University, the Miller Introduction to Judaism program. So I didn't write the curriculum, but happy to expand on it if there are any areas of interest that you really want to know more about. So the Hebrew Bible is broken down into 3 sections, as we said before. The acronym for this sections are Tanakh. The T stands for, anybody know what the T might stand for? It's what we learned about last week. The T stands for Torah. The N stands for Nevi'im, which is the books of prophets. And the K stands for Ketuvim, which are writings. Torah, prophets, writings. Each week, we chant a section of the Torah called a parashah. Which literally just means section. We also chant a portion of the prophets called a haftarah. We chant the Torah portion out of the Torah scroll itself. We chant the haftarah from any book that we can find. And on 5 major holidays, we chant from the book of writings called a Megillah. When we think about a Megillah, often we think about Megillat Esther most often, because on Purim, that's our biggest chanting of the Megillah. That's our big fun celebration of the story of Esther. But Esther is really only one of the 5 Megillot, and we'll learn more about those 5 Megillot in just a second. Let's see if I can view this full screen. Slideshow, there we go. All right. Is this visible? Oh, that is not how I wanted to view it. Let's try this again. We'll just do it the normal way. All right. The Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. So Torah, we talked about last week, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Nevi'im is the book of prophets. Now, if you've learned Bible before, this is in a different order than you may have learned it. We start out with some historical books, with books that go in historical order, starting from after Moses is overlooking the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan. Moses dies in Nebo, and then the people Israel, led by Joshua, go into the land. So Joshua is the leader after Moses. Joshua leads the people Israel in conquering a whole lot of the land of Israel. But at that point in time, the people are all, even though they're united as an army, after they conquer the land, they are given their own, each one of the tribes is given its own land. I kind of like to think of this as, if you know American history, as the Articles of Confederation. They're loosely, the tribes are all loosely connected, but aren't ruled as one. So they sometimes have military partnerships, but the book of Judges really tells us how there's a whole lot of chaos during this time because the tribes are fighting with one another. And we hear a lot of stories that you may have heard before. So we hear the story of Deborah, the prophetess, and Yael, who cuts off the enemy king's, or the enemy general's head. We hear these weird stories like Deborah and Yael. We hear the story of Samson and his hair. We hear a whole lot of different stories in this book of Judges. And the thing that's kind of similar between each of these stories is that there's a chaotic nature to each one of these leaders. The message that we are supposed to get from that is is the message that we get at the end of the book, that we're in a state of chaos. We really need some more unity, and the people of Israel want a king. They want a king to bring them all together. Fast forward to Samuel, book of Samuel. And at the beginning of the book of Samuel, we have a prophet named Samuel. We have a story about Hannah, who's a beautiful figure in all her own. But Samuel is a prophetic figure, kind of an advisor sort of figure. And even though he tells the people of Israel, you really, really don't want a king, they say, we really, really do want a king. Can you please appoint one for us? And so in consultation with God, Samuel anoints Saul. Saul goes a little bit crazy. And then we get King David kind of at the meeting point between Samuel 1 and 2. Samuel 2 is really King David's story. And between Samuel 2 and Kings 1, we get King Solomon. So those are the three big kings of the unified nation, right? Of the unified nation of Israel. So we have Saul, David, and then Solomon, our wise King Solomon. But King Solomon has a few too many wives and worships few too many idols. And so after his death, the kingdom is split. So Kings 1 and Kings 2, especially Kings 2, go on to tell us the story about two separate kingdoms, two separate bits of Israel. The north is called Israel often, and then the south is called Judah. So we learn about Israel and Judah. We're going to look at more of a timeline of Israel and Judah in a little bit. But those two kingdoms are split. We learn about their kings throughout the book of Kings. Then we hear about some prophets. We've got three major prophets. They're called major prophets because their books are really, really, really long. They are prophesizing at different points in Israelite history. And then our minor prophets, the only thing that really makes them minor is that they are shorter books. You may have heard maybe the most famous of these minor prophets is Jonah. And Jonah is kind of a different feel than the rest of the prophetic books. The rest of the prophetic books take place during these books of Kings, but Jonah is kind of on its own. Jonah's a man who's called by God to prophesy not to the people of Israel, but to the people of Nineveh, who are a completely different nation unto themselves. So Jonah's kind of a separate book, but other than that, they're all taking place during these books of Kings. The Ketuvim, the writings, are kind of an amalgamation of things. Psalms we use in our prayers. Mostly that's the big use of Psalms is through prayer. I'll skip over these two for just a second, but these five are our 5 Megillot. The Song of Songs, which is a love story, and we interpret it as a love story between God and the people Israel. That's something that we read on Passover, which is the holiday we're about to get to. Ruth, we read on Shavuot. Shavuot is a holiday that's going to come later in the spring, early summer, late spring. Ruth is a beautiful story that we interpret now to be a conversion story, the conversion story of a woman whose mother-in-law is Jewish, and she learns from her mother-in-law. She follows her mother-in-law around. We read it on Shavuot, mostly because it's all about wheat harvest, and Shavuot is celebrating the end of the wheat harvest. Lamentations we read on the holiday of Tisha B'Av, which is a fast day in the summer. On Tisha B'Av, we recognize a whole bunch of tragedies that have happened to the Jewish people, including and mainly the destruction of the first and second temples in Jerusalem. Ecclesiastes is my favorite book in all of Tanakh. We also call it Kohelet. because Kohelet is his name in Hebrew. And we read Ecclesiastes on Sukkot, which is our festival of booths. Esther, we read on Purim. We'll learn about these holidays in time to come as well. So going back to the rest of the books of writings, how do we use these books? What I didn't mention, I mentioned on the page before, but the books that we tend to read from for our Haftarah are all of these ones here. Prophets are what we read from for every weekend and every holiday. We read as kind of an after reading to Torah. Usually the story in the Haftarah correlates with the Torah story or with the holiday that we're celebrating. So Ketuvim, Psalms, and then these 5 are really the ones that have fixed places in our liturgy and in our Jewish tradition. But all of the rest of these books also are quoted throughout our prayers, are quoted throughout our Talmud, which is a later sacred writing, that writing that was written about 0 to 600 of the Common Era. So Proverbs is going to be Proverbs. It's sayings, it's kind of pithy statements of advice, rumored to be written by King Solomon. Job is kind of a nihilistic view of the world. It's seen as an angry book, but it also has a lot of truth to it. Daniel is actually the only book that's written in a different language. It's written in Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew. And that's a book that's written post-exile, meaning between the destruction of the first and second temple. Ezra and Nehemiah take place when we're coming back from the first exile. We're going to see that on the timeline in the next page. And Chronicles 1 and 2 are basically a retelling of Torah and prophets, but with a lot of genealogy and a lot of little details. Questions about the contents of all these books? It's a lot. All right. I said last week when I showed you the list of books, if you don't have a whole lot of familiarity with the Bible, or if you do have familiarity and you just want to review the big stories, the JPS Children's Bible is really a wonderful resource. Also, if you're in the synagogue, if you're studying with us on a Shabbat, when I talk about Tanakh, I'm talking about this book or this book. So if you're at the synagogue, ask me to show you a Tanakh. This is the book that we're talking about. A little bit of the timeline of where all this stuff takes place in history. We talked mostly about all of this. The patriarchs and the matriarchs, that's last week, that's Torah. Take place over here, 1900 to 1700 BCE. Exodus from Egypt is about 1250. Then in 1200, and we've got a little bit of archaeological proof of this, the conquest of Canaan happens by Joshua and by the Israelites, followed by the period of the Judges from 1200 to 1025. What, again, I like to call the Articles of the Confederacy, because it's a little bit disjointed and the people of Israel make a lot of mistakes. We unify the monarchy in 1025 with Saul. We have Saul, David, Solomon, those are the big 3. And in Solomon's time, our first holy temple is constructed. Soon after that, we've got the monarchy is divided. Those are Solomon's children. And if you'd like to learn more about these dramatic stories of these kings, we're learning the 929 chapters of Tanakh together on Saturdays after lunch. So please come join our learning. Throughout this time, we get some prophets that you may have heard of. The prophet Elijah is around 850 BCE. He is around during the time of the divided monarchy. We have Hosea and Amos are going to happen. Hosea and Amos, Isaiah and Micah are all going to happen right around here. We have, speaking to the northern kingdoms, we have Hosea and Amos. They speak a lot about themes of justice. You may have heard Dr. Martin Luther King quote them a lot. That's a lot of where he got his rhetoric from, was from those books of Hosea and Amos that are kind of railing against the inequality that, surprise, surprise, was also around back then, the gap between the rich and the poor, and the priestly class and everyone else. Isaiah and Micah are speaking to Judah in the south. So this is pre-destruction of the temple. This is while we still have our first temple. Judah, which is the south, has Isaiah and Micah during that time. The northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria here in 722 BCE. And then the southern kingdom falls in 586. The first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. Jeremiah is speaking right around here to the southern kingdom, saying, "What are you doing? Our temple's about to be destroyed. Where are you? Why are you sacrificing to different gods?" So he's right around here. Ezekiel is speaking right around there too, but Ezekiel's speaking in the period of Babylonian exile. So Ezekiel's speaking once the first temple is destroyed and the Israelites are exiled. Haggai is right around here. This is for those of you who are interested in the specifics of where the prophets are. Isaiah actually shows up here also. The book of Isaiah is kind of in 2 or 3 parts, depending on how you look at it. Isaiah shows up back here and over here. So as the northern kingdom was defeated by Assyria, southern kingdom is going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. Then, after we've only been in exile for a little bit, the Persians get power, and they, under Cyrus II, are going to say, "Hey, Israelites or Jews, you can come on back, at least to the southern, at least to Judah, because the northern kingdoms have dispersed." These are the lost tribes that we often talk about. And as they come back, as the second temple is reconstructed, we get the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which really talk about how the Jewish community is brought together again and the Torah is canonized during that time. Questions about our timeline, our historical timeline here? All right. So these books of Tanakh are not just books of law or not just nice stories, but it also gives us a big overhead view of how our religion came to be. All right. I want to take a moment, and we're going to read in different modes here. Sometimes we're going to read out loud. Sometimes we're going to read to ourselves, just because I know everybody has different learning styles. Abraham Joshua Heschel, I think we read a little bit of him before. He is a rabbi that's around at the height of I don't want to say his fame, but at the height of his professional life in the 60s. Especially in the civil rights movement and later in the anti-war movement for Vietnam. He writes a big, long, thick book called The Prophets, where he really analyzes each of the books from a biblical perspective, and then also kind of ties in or refers to, in an offhand way, the things that are going on during his time also. So what I'd like for us to ask is, we're going to read this to ourselves, and I'd like to ask you that question that he asks: what manner of man is the prophet? How does Heschel understand the role of the prophets in Tanakh? So read on your own and ask that question again. How do you understand the role of the prophets? And we'll come back together in just a few minutes. You're welcome to type in the chat or just to say out loud, how do you think that Rabbi Heschel understands the role of the prophets? He's referring to the biblical prophets.
From what I read, he's explaining that there are people that feel very deeply, and they feel and interpret God's emotion, so to speak, and particularly in regards to like injustice and things that aren't fair, and speak and have like a sense of like pressure to speak out about these things, even if it's not popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're that voice that speaks out even when others aren't going to speak out. And they're interpreters of God's emotions also. They're the ones who say, God's really angry that you're doing this. And just to be a little bit more specific, one of the reasons why I showed that timeline is to show that the prophets are acting in real history. So what the prophets are saying is, this kingdom is going to be destroyed if we don't treat everybody with a little bit more equality, or with a lot more equality, right? If we don't get rid of this injustice, our kingdom is going to be destroyed. And lo and behold, the kingdoms are destroyed. So that's the framework in which they're speaking. What else? Either Michaela or Kurtina, what is one of the roles of the prophets, according to Heschel? We're going to continue. So that was Heschel's interpretation of the prophets. But now we're going to actually read from Isaiah. Oh, here we go. Couldn't see it to read it. So if there's ever a time when you can't see it, please let me know, because I've read this before. So please let me know if you can't see it, and then I can always zoom in.
Sorry.
That's okay. You don't have to say sorry, but just let me know in the future. we're going to read from Isaiah. This is a reading that we read on Yom Kippur, which is our big fast day of the year. And it's great that we read it on a fast day because he's not a huge fan of fasts. So we're going to read this. I'll read this out loud, and I'll ask the question again. How do we understand the role of the prophets from reading this text? And also, why in the world would we read this on a fast day? So this is Isaiah chapter 58. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people. Remember, this is Isaiah speaking in God's name. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the fast that I've chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed, and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to Adonai? Is not this the kind of fast I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Now that we've read Isaiah's words or heard Isaiah's words, what is Isaiah's role here?
He's expressing God's word of the point of fasting or the sacred activities is to bring about transformation and change, not just for the sake of doing it. But yeah, that's what I get from that.
So our rituals have meaning. We're
Mhm.
not just doing it to do it. We're not just doing it. Or not only do our rituals have meaning, but our rituals are not the only commandments that we have. We're not just commanded to light candles or to give sacrifices or to fast. We're commanded to love the other as ourselves. That's just as important, if not more important of a commandment than all the fasting and the rituals. So Isaiah is reminding the people of their responsibilities to God. I think another big question is, why in the world would we read this on a fast day?
To be reminded and inspired.
Yeah, to be reminded and inspired of what?
Of whatever changes need to be made, of whatever we're not doing that we should be doing, or whatever we're doing that we shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
To remind us to change ourselves.
Great. That we're not just fasting, but we are fasting as a reminder to ourselves to be doing all of these other things, to be sharing our food with the hungry and providing the poor wanderer with shelter. Absolutely. These were just a little taste of the prophets, they speak a whole lot about the injustices that they're seeing. And what's, I think, a little bit fascinating, or sadly fascinating, about all of this is that it's all still relevant today. We never stopped. We never stopped having those yokes, right? We never stopped oppression, and we never stopped having poor people among us. We still read the prophets. And again, this is still the living Torah, the living, breathing Torah, the living, breathing Tanakh, because we still need to be reminded of all of these words. I'm curious, as we finish kind of learning a whole bunch of information, I'm curious to ask both Sephora and Michaela. I think Joyce is out of the room and I'm not sure where the others went, but I'm curious what role the Bible has taken in your life so far. What has your experience been with the Bible so far? And are there any particular takeaways from today that might affect that experience? And I'll give you just a couple of minutes to write that down, just so you can collect your thoughts. I'm going to type those questions in the chat again. What has your experience with the Bible been in your life so far? And are there any particular takeaways from today that might affect that experience? And you're welcome to either write your answer in the chat or you're okay. You can either write your answer in the chat or you can say it out loud whenever you're ready.
So I was typing that. I'd rather just say it. So, my experience has been mostly the study of the New Testament, or like, I would say Jesus's teachings. Almost like everything before that was considered kind of irrelevant, or just not a lot of focus on it. Which, I don't disagree with Jesus' teachings. I feel like he taught a lot of good things about being a good person. So like, I mean, it's like when I was little, I remember learning more Bible stories from, I guess you would say, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, but I know that's not the right term. But it's like after being young and being in like Bible school, it's like that's not talked about much anymore. And so it's like I have like this familiarity with some of these other books, but it's like not emphasized much in Catholicism or Christianity. It's I don't know. So I'm letting it absorb still, but I'm seeing relevance. I'm seeing relevance in like reviewing it.
Right.
It's kind of hard to verbalize like what, just because I feel like my perception of things is changing and transforming in a lot of ways. So yeah.
And we're talking right now, we're asking the question, what has your experience with the Bible been in your life so far? And even though I know that you were occupied for quite a bit of time, how does today transform that perspective at all? And Michaela had said that her experience with the Bible has been good. Before she made the decision to take this class, she had gone off of what she was taught growing up in the Christian faith. So it sounds like similar to Sephora. And Joyce, I'll invite you to share your thoughts, but I'll give you a minute to think because you just sat down. But
About what the Bible means to me? Or
yeah, what's your experience been with it so far?
the Bible has always been a way of life for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in a Christian community and very devout Christian. So we were taught the Bible from day one, and so it became a way of life.
Wonderful. And then I think my answer is pretty similar in that it's always given me a framework to live and language to understand and communicate my responsibilities to myself, to my community, to God. And it also gives me language, especially in the Psalms to express my gratitude to God. There's a lot of poetry in Tanakh that provides me with the language, because sometimes it's just so hard to express all of the emotion that comes along with being in relationship with God and being in a relationship with this world. So I know that we've already learned this, but I just want to answer Joyce's question because she was out of the room when we answered this question before. But just as a final review of what we spoke about earlier today, when we talk about Tanakh, it's more than just Torah. It's the entire Hebrew Bible. So Tanakh stands for Torah, Nevi'im, which is prophets, and Ketuvim, which is writings, and it encompasses a whole lot of these books. But thank you for learning with me. Next week, we are going to hear from a couple of different rabbis from different denominations within Judaism. Judaism isn't monolithic, so we'll learn a few different perspectives about Judaism next week. Thank you for learning. I hope, not next week, because very important to share. Next week is Passover.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, next week is Passover. It starts on Tuesday night and goes through, let's see, it's 8 days, but I get very confused with math because in Jewish tradition, we all of our holidays start at nighttime. So I get confused with math. We start on Wednesday night, and we end on Thursday, April 13th. So Wednesday to Thursday, April 5th to the 13th. If you, I'm not supposed to say this, Joyce knows I'm not supposed to say this, but if you would like to come to a Passover Seder, we don't really have space, but we do have space for you. So we do have space for you. So please let me know if you'd like to come to Seder. The tickets are $36 a person, but if you're not able to afford it, we have people who have donated for your sake as well. So please let me know so that we can make sure we have enough food for you if you'd like to come. It's on Thursday, April 6th at 6:00 p.m.
So our Zoom classes are not.
So our Zoom class is not happening next Thursday and the Thursday after. We'll be back in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
All right. Have a wonderful